It's Harlan County, Kentucky. In 1934, at 5:42 in the evening, the shift change whistle from the mining camp drifted across the valley before a single figure appeared on the dirt road outside. In the wooden kitchen, a 38-year-old woman set a cast-iron skillet onto the wood-burning stove. The metal struck the stovetop with a heavy sound, and a fine layer of ash trembled around the edges. She pulled a small chair closer, placed the sack of corn on it, and spared her knees from having to lower themselves to the floor one more time. The lunch pail had not yet returned. The piece of cornbread had already dried out, the card in the receipt box. On the table sat a bowl of cooked greens, 2 pieces of cornbread from the morning meal, an old coffee can holding bacon grease, 3 enamel plates, and the space where her husband's lunch pail usually rested after every shift. The smell of wood smoke mingled with the scent of cooled greens. The whistle faded away. The lunch pail still had not returned. She pulled the recipe box down from the shelf. The lid sat crooked in its groove, and even when closed, it left a thin, dark gap. The top card carried 5 words written in pencil: "Save the liquid." Crumble bread into it. Looked at the pale green liquid in the bottom of the pot of greens, then placed the card beside the 2 dry pieces of cornbread. Inside the box, one card read, "Corn, clean ash, wash 3 times." The next card read, "Cabbage, salt, keep under water." Near the bottom of the box was a card darkened with grease. "Save some bread for tomorrow morning." None of the cards listed temperatures or cooking times. She looked at the spreading grease to know when the skillet was hot enough. Pressed a fingertip into the bread to judge how much moisture should remain, listened to the spoon striking the bottom of the can to know how many days were left. In that kitchen, the pot liquor from the greens, the dry cornbread, and the bacon grease all still had work to do. Recipe number 30 began with dried corn and lye water strained from wood ash. Recipe number 25 rested in a stoneware crock beneath the house of a widow in North Carolina, where tiny bubbles still rose every day. Recipe number 20 was a pot of beans placed inside a wooden box filled with straw after the fire had died down. Recipe number 1 would return to this cast-iron skillet when only 1 plate remained on the table, and tomorrow morning's portion of bread had already been set aside. If old skillets, handwritten recipe cards, kitchens that stretched very little food across many meals still remind you of someone, follow Old American Kitchen. Each week, the recipe box will be opened once more. Outside on the porch, the sound of shoes finally touched the ground. She opened the grease can, set the spoon inside, and pulled the tub of corn closer. 30 stories begin with what had been sitting beneath the stove all morning. A handful of wood ash. Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1934, the sack of corn, the grease can, and the lunch pail hanging behind the door. Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1934, the outer hull of a corn kernel slipped away beneath a thumb after many hours resting in the clear liquid strained from wood ash. The 38-year-old woman tested a kernel, rubbed it between her palms, and tilted the tub so the cloudy water flowed away. Her husband worked in the coal mines. Some weeks he worked all 6 shifts. Some weeks the whistle still echoed across the valley, but the metal lunch pail remained hanging behind the door because his name was not on the list of men going down into the mine. A 10-pound sack of dried corn cost about 32 cents, enough to stretch through many batches of cornbread, hominy, and porridge for a family of 5. She used clean hardwood ash, mixed it with water, waited for the sediment to settle, then poured the clear liquid into a pot. The tub of corn sat on a small chair beside the stove. The lye water felt slightly slippery against her hands. The hulls gradually softened, and the smell of smoke disappeared after the 3rd washing. She knew the kernels were ready by touch alone. While the cast-iron skillet was still warm, she scraped away the crumbs with a wooden spatula and wiped the inside with a rag. An old skillet at the trading market might cost nearly 78 cents, but the one in her kitchen had already passed through at least 2 generations. The smoother section of the handle was where her mother-in-law had once gripped it. A thin layer of grease was rubbed across the iron before the skillet was returned to the nail behind the stove. Bacon grease was kept in a coffee can dented on one side. A pound of bacon or salt pork cost about 23 cents, so even the stream of golden grease passing through a cloth had to serve many meals. When cooled, it turned ivory white. Just the tip of a spoon was enough for greens, eggs, or cornbread. The sound of metal scraping the side of the can was thin and dry. She spooned the greens onto plates, but saved the liquid at the bottom of the pot. One piece of cornbread was crumbled into the lightest enamel bowl, reserved for the youngest child, while the remaining portion waited for her husband's late return. Steam fogged the side of the bowl, and the bread absorbed the liquid from the center outward. The 2 pieces of cornbread from the morning were then split horizontally. The cut sides were placed face down in a thin layer of grease and sizzled in the skillet. A spoonful of water was added to one corner, and the lid was lowered into place. The smell of toasted corn spread through the kitchen. The piece with the browner edge was placed beside her husband's chair. The sound of shoes reached the porch just as steam escaped from beneath the lid. The lunch pail was set beside the door, coal dust clinging around the latch. After supper, the skillet returned to its nail, the grease can sat to the left of the stove, and tomorrow morning's piece of bread was placed beside the lunch pail. The next kitchen waited for winter, beneath a cellar where jars stood motionless in the darkness while continuing to change. Ashe County, North Carolina, in 1930. The jars that held the work of Summer Ashe County, North Carolina. 1932, the blade slicing cabbage struck the wooden table with a steady rhythm, while beneath the floor, the cellar door opened to a current of cool air carrying the scent of damp earth. The mine whistle, the lunch pail, and the coal dust had been left behind. In this kitchen, the recipe box sat beside an oil lamp. The top card bore a faint water ring, one corner stiff with brine, and the words, "Cabbage, salt, keep under water." Beneath it was a smaller note, "Pick out soft ones on Monday." The woman was 46 years old and had lost her husband 3 years earlier. She lived with her 16-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old son. In summer, the garden produced more than 3 people could eat. In winter, snow could block the road to town for many days. Recipe number 25 began with cabbages costing about 3 cents each and roughly 2 cents worth of salt for a large crock. She shredded the cabbage, sprinkled salt between the layers, and squeezed until liquid seeped through her fingers. The cabbage was packed into the bottom of the crock with a wet, heavy sound. A plate and a clean weight kept everything beneath the surface of the brine. A few days later, tiny bubbles appeared around the edges. The crock stood still, yet inside it the work continued. Recipe number 24 rested in a small jar tied with green string. The cucumbers from the garden were packed upright and covered with brine flavored with garlic and dill, with the seasonings costing about 3 cents in total. The jar was small enough for her son to handle himself, allowing him to take 2 pickles after returning from the field. The cucumber skins changed color, the scent of dill lingered on his fingers, and the sound of the lid touching the rim reminded him to close it before leaving. Recipe number 23 gathered 3 peppers, a handful of beans, 2 turnips, and several small cucumbers into a single jar. Vinegar, salt, and spices cost about 6 cents. The handle of a wooden spoon pushed air bubbles to the surface, and a strip of red cloth tied around the neck of the jar marked it as the spicy batch meant for winter bean pots. Down in the cellar, its recipe number 22 was preserved by darkness, damp sand, and regular inspection. Potatoes cost about 1.5 cents per pound, and autumn apples about 16 cents per small basket. She lifted each potato, turned each apple, and set any softened ones aside to be used first. Outside at the spring house, recipe number 21 was kept cold by spring water flowing around milk crocks. A quart of milk was worth about 9 cents, and a small amount of butter about 12 cents. She secured the crock, with a flat stone worn smooth through years of use, then handed each one to her daughter standing on the steps. The cellar door closed. The sauerkraut continued to bubble. The water continued flowing around the milk crocks, and the note inside the recipe box waited for Monday. The next kitchen stood near a factory where a wooden box packed with straw waited for a pot of food that had just come off the fire. The first half of Elizabethton, Tennessee, 1933, the bean pot continued to soften. After the woman had already sat down Elizabethton, Tennessee, in 1933, a pot of beans at a rolling boil was lifted from the stove while the beans inside were still firm in the center. The 34-year-old woman gripped both handles with a thick folded cloth, walked a short distance to a wooden box, packed with straw beneath the end of the table, and lowered the pot into the prepared space. Heat rose against her wrists. Dry straw rustled around the sides of the pot before old cloths were pressed down and the lid of the box was closed. The shift at the rayon factory ended at 5 o'clock in the evening. By the time she reached the rented house, the rhythm of the machine still echoed in her ears, and her feet had been standing for nearly the entire day. Her husband was looking for work in another state. In the house were 2 children, 1 cooking stove, 2 enamel bowls, and a chair she had not yet sat in. Dried beans cost about 6 cents a pound. Extra wood or coal for fuel could cost 11 cents, so she soaked the beans the night before, changed the water after work, and boiled them until the surface of the pot rolled vigorously. The heat trapped between the straw and cloth continued working its way through each bean while she washed her hands, mended the cuff of her daughter's sleeve, and placed 3 spoons on the table. When the lid was opened, the smell of hot beans mixed with the scent of warm straw and old fabric. The pot provided enough food for 3 people that evening, with the remainder saved for the next day. On the rear stove burner, recipe number 19 began with a small sack of bones costing about 4 cents. A ham bone was rinsed and dropped into a deep pot with water, a softened onion, and a little salt. Her younger child had a cough, and she needed a bowl of hot broth with the flavor of meat when the week's money did not allow for anything more. The foam that rose to the surface was skimmed into a chipped china plate. The fire was lowered, and the boiling settled into a gentle rhythm. The onion changed its aroma. Steam coated the window pane with a thin film. The bits of meat tucked between the bones were removed, cooled on the windowsill, and saved for the next morning's bread. The bone remained in the pot until the broth turned a pale golden color. Night fell, and she finally sat down. The straw box kept the bean pot warm. Beneath the table, the bone broth continued to tremble gently on the back of the stove, and beside the shelf stood a crock of eggs, a jug of milk beginning to change, and the whey left from the last batch of cheese. The next morning, those perishable foods would have to be decided upon before she returned to the factory. The briquette box appears for the 3rd time Elizabethton, Tennessee, in 1933. Eggs, milk, and the things that were not thrown away just because they had changed Elizabethton, Tennessee, the following morning in 1933. The straw box still sat beneath the table. The bean pot had returned to the stovetop, and the factory shoes stood beside the door, with dry gray dust around their soles. The woman pulled down the recipe box before waking the 2 children. A note listing work shifts was tucked behind a card that read, "Bring to a boil, then place in straw." The next card read, "Crack eggs separately." And a card marked with a streak of white flour were 4 words, "Sour milk for biscuits." She placed the box beside the crock of eggs. A dozen eggs cost about 21 cents at the time, while enough water glass solution for a small crock cost about 10 cents. Eggs with their natural protective coating still intact had been placed into the crock during a week when the hens laid heavily, and a piece of paper tied around the neck recorded the date. She lifted 1 egg, dried it, then cracked it into a tin cup before adding it to the mixing bowl. The shell tapped the side of the cup with a delicate sound. A single spoiled egg could ruin the batter intended for the entire family. The younger child frowned when she raised the milk jug to smell it. A quart of milk was worth about 9 cents, while the ingredients for a small batch of biscuits cost about 5 cents more. She poured the slightly soured milk into a bowl, added grease, salt, and leavening, and mixed until the dough clung to the sides in rough patches around the wooden spoon. The dented tin cup cut 6 biscuits. One smaller biscuit was set aside for the child who was still coughing. The sour smell of the milk softened beneath the heat. Grease sizzled around the bottom of the skillet, and the biscuits rose before turning golden. The whey from the previous cheese-making remained in a jug tied with a dark string. She poured it little by little into the next batch of dough, stopping when the dough began to pull away from the sides of the bowl. Using that liquid allowed her to save milk, worth about 3 cents for another meal. 3 biscuits were wrapped in a towel, 2 for the children and 1 to take with her to the factory. The crock of eggs returned beneath the table, the whey jug stood behind the water jug, and the recipe box closed beside the tin cup, left upside down to dry. When the door closed, the bean pot still held enough food for supper. Meat removed from the bone waited on a plate, and in another part of West Virginia, a knife was about to touch a cutting board outside a smokehouse. Pocahontas County, West Virginia, 1930, 6 meat for the house, meat for the woods, and the bones not yet alive to leave the kitchen. Pocahontas County, West Virginia, in 1936, pieces of white fat fell into the bottom of a deep pot with a soft, heavy sound. Outside, a metal bucket had just been set down on the ground. The door of the smokehouse scraped across the damp earth while a knife continued striking the cutting board in the kitchen, where the recipe box had been opened for the 4th time. Tucked between 2 recipe cards was a faded piece of salt wrapping paper. The top card read, "Meat for the house, meat for the woods, bones for the pot." 3 pencil marks on the back divided a single animal into 3 separate uses. The woman was 40 years old and lived beside a road used by logging wagons. Her husband worked on a logging crew, sometimes returning home every evening and sometimes sleeping for several days in a camp near the cutting site. Behind the kitchen stood a small smokehouse. Hanging beside its door were a pair of work gloves and a cloth sack intended for food carried into the woods. Recipe number 15 began over a low fire. She cut the fat into small pieces and stirred along the bottom until the cracklings floated to the surface and turned golden. The rendered fat was strained into clean jars. The first jar was tied with a red string and held the whitest, least aromatic fat, reserved for baking. The remaining jars would be used for eggs, vegetables, beans, and the cast iron skillet. That amount of fat could replace between 35 and 50 cents worth of shortening over many months. The smell of hot fat clung to hair, curtains, and sleeves until the final jar had cooled. Recipe number 14 rested on the cold wooden table. A large sack of salt costing about 7 cents was rubbed onto every surface of the meat, pressed deep into the crevices, and spread until the entire piece was covered. This portion was intended for the household, where thin slices would later flavor bean pots or skillet gravy. The starting date was written on the back of an old envelope and pinned beside the door so she would remember when to turn the meat, inspect any damp spots, and add more salt if necessary. Inside the smokehouse, recipe number 13 hung from a beam. Hickory smoke crept around hams and bacon, gradually darkening their surfaces. That ham might have cost between 60 and 80 cents if purchased elsewhere. She stepped onto a low stool, touched the surface of the meat, then fastened, the latch positioned high enough to stay beyond the reach of children. The smell of smoke arrived before the light each time the door was opened. At the end of the day, the jars of rendered fat had been placed on the shelf. The envelope marked with the date rested beside the door, and strips of meat still lay on the table, waiting to be wrapped. The cloth sack was not yet full, and the bones had not yet gone into the pot. The next morning, the work of turning one animal into many meals would continue. Pocahontas County, West Virginia, 1930. 6. The portions of food that had to travel far from the kitchen, Pocahontas County, West Virginia. The following morning in 1936, strips of venison lay arranged in portions beside a pair of work gloves and an axe. The smokehouse behind the house still held the scent of hickory in its wooden walls. On the shelf, a jar of rendered fat tied with a red string had cooled to an opaque white, and the scrap of envelope marked with the date remained pinned beside the door. The husband's cloth food sack lay open on a chair, waiting for food that could travel deep into the woods without ever needing a pot. Recipe number 12 began with meat trimmed from the bones and sliced into nearly equal strips. The venison came from a hunting trip. Each cartridge had cost about 4 to 6 cents, in addition to the many hours spent in the woods, dressing the animal and processing it before the temperature changed. She rubbed salt into each strip, dried and smoked them according to the family method, then squeezed the center of each piece before allowing it to cool. The surface had dried while the inside remained slightly soft. The scent of smoke and salt clung to the clean cloth as she wrapped portions for the days her husband worked far from camp. The packet intended for the first day was placed nearest the opening of the sack. A smaller piece was set aside for the son, who would walk with his father to the end of the road early that morning. After the best cuts of meat had been divided, recipe number 11 remained on the cutting board. The bones went into a pot, skin was set aside, and every scrap of meat fell into a chipped enamel bowl positioned on the right side of the table. The knife scraped across the bones with a dry sound. She turned each piece beneath the window light, searching the crevices for bits still attached, then dropped them into water that was slowly heating. The resulting broth, fat, recovered meat could replace a meat meal worth about 10 to 15 cents. Foam was skimmed from the surface of the pot. The skin and fat would flavor a pot of beans. The scraps of meat would go into gravy or the next morning's bread, and the bone broth would be poured over bread for the children. By the time the cutting board was nearly clean, the enamel bowl held more than it had at the beginning. The husband tied the food sack beside his blanket and axe. Before he stepped out of the yard, she slipped one more piece of bread into an outer pocket. That evening, one place at the table would remain empty, but the smokehouse still held meat for the household. There was still rendered fat on the shelf, and the pot still contained enough hot broth for 2 children. The next story travels to Floyd County, where 4 bowls are waiting for a little sorghum to be divided equally. Floyd County, Kentucky, in 1938 summer, left its cull on children's hands, and spring returned with the smell of wild onions. Floyd County, Kentucky, in 1938, the recipe box was pulled down from a high shelf on an afternoon, filled with the sound of children drifting in from the garden behind the house. The cards near the bottom of the box contained fewer words than those above them. One corner of a card was stained dark with syrup, and an old purple mark had soaked so deeply into the paper fibers that it could never be wiped away. One card read, "Skim foam until the spoon draws a thread." Another carried only 2 short words, "Divide 6 ways." The woman was 36 years old and lived with her husband and 4 children. Work at the apple packing house was steady only during certain seasons. On the high shelf sat a tin holding white sugar. Around the house were the things that the seasons provided before cash appeared. Recipe number 10 began with a large kettle of sorghum juice over a wood fire. 1 jar of sorghum could replace sugar worth between 25 and 40 cents for many weeks. She stood beside the kettle, skimming away the foam and watching the syrup darken. 4 children took turns carrying small pieces of firewood. The youngest sat on the doorstep, waiting for the syrup, still clinging to the final spoon. Sweet steam mixed with wood smoke. Only when the syrup stretched into a short thread from the edge of the spoon was an entire day's work poured into jars. By Sunday, recipe number 9 sat in the center of the table on a tin plate. Sorghum pie cost about 22 cents to make if the household already had syrup. She cut the pie into 6 portions. The knife paused briefly before making the final cut. As always, her slice was served last. Recipe number 8 came from a basket of berries gathered from the edge of the woods. Flour, grease, and a little sorghum for a skillet cobbler cost about 13 cents. Purple-stained fingertips set the basket beside the stove. Berry juice burst along the edges of the skillet, leaving streaks of color through the rising batter. The towel used to wipe the berries was hung separately on the clothesline. Recipe number 7 was made from young dandelion greens gathered around the property. A little vinegar and grease cost only about 3 cents. The green leaves wilted as soon as they touched the heat, carrying the first taste of a new season after months of preserved food. Recipe number 6 ended the mini arc with the smell of wild onions and 2 eggs worth about 5 cents. Dirt still clung to the roots when the bundle of onions was carried into the kitchen. The onions were sautéed first, eggs added afterward. The sharp aroma spread all the way to the porch, where the youngest child knew it was time to find shoes and head into the garden. As evening fell, the bundle of onions was hung on the porch, a purple-stained towel swayed on the clothesline, and the sounds of children gradually drifted farther from the door. The woman returned the recipe box to the shelf. Near the bottom of the box, the cards held only a few brief words, as though everything else had been memorized through years of repeating the same work. The next story travels to Wise County in 1939. It's where only a single plate has been taken down onto the table. Wise County, Virginia, in 1939, when only one person remained in the kitchen, but supper was still served. Wise County, Virginia, 1939, 2 bundles of dried leaves brushed against one another beneath a low beam as the wind slipped through the kitchen roof. The 62-year-old woman took a single enamel plate down to the table, set the lightest bowl at the outer edge, and placed a small knife into the cup at her right hand. Letters from Ohio and Pennsylvania still rested in the drawer beneath the tablecloth. The recipe box on the shelf carried handwriting that was larger and shorter, just enough for one person to read while standing near the stove. Recipe number 5 began with tiny bubbles in the sourdough crock resting on a cracked plate. A 5-pound sack of flour cost about 26 cents, while purchased yeast could cost an additional 2 to 3 cents per batch. She added flour and water, stirred until the starter trailed behind the spoon in short strands, then covered the crock with a cloth. Each time she removed a portion for a small loaf, she left enough behind for the next batch. The crock remained alive through that work. Recipe number 4 rested in small mason jars worth about 7 cents each. Tomatoes from the garden were preserved in quantities suited to a single person. She wiped the rims of the jars, checked the lids after they cooled, and wrote 39 in grease pencil. The oldest jar stood at the front. A dry popping sound echoed, and her hand paused before moving to the next one. Recipe number 3 hung at chest height. Mint was used for evening tea, while sage went into gravy or a small pot of soup. The dried leaves crumbled lightly between her fingers, leaving their fragrance on her skin. Bundles had been hung at a height she could still comfortably reach. Recipe number 2 fell into a galvanized bucket as gray dust. These she pushed aside the pieces of coal that could still be used, divided the ashes into 2 light loads, and spread them thinly across the garden rows her husband had once dug. The trail of footprints from the kitchen door to the garden was shorter than it had been before. Recipe number 1 used 1 bowl, 1 spoon, and a small cast-iron skillet. 7 cents worth of cornmeal, slightly soured milk, salt, and bacon grease became a cake for supper. The hot grease embraced the edges of the batter, the bottom crisped, and the center retained its moisture. She cut the cake in half, with a motion her hand knew well. 1 half was placed on the plate, the other was wrapped in a towel and left beside the recipe box for the following morning. The skillet was wiped clean while still warm. The knife returned to its cup. Supper was still served for the person who remained seated at the table. The card is returned, and the recipie box does not close completely. 5:42 in the evening in Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1934, the shift change whistle had fallen silent, but the small chair still stood beside the stove, and the card on the table still read, "Save the liquid, crumble bread into it." From that kitchen, objects had passed through many hands. The tub of corn rested on the small chair so the woman would not have to bend down. One more time, the grease can sat to the left of the stove. The lunch pail hung behind the door on days when there was no shift, then returned covered in coal dust to receive the piece of bread with the crispier edge. In Ashe County, a flat stone held the milk crock in the cold spring water. The oil lamp waited on its brick, the pickle jar tied with green string sat within reach of the boy. The softened apple was always brought upstairs before the ones beside it began to change as well. In Elizabethton, the straw box remained beneath the table, continuing to soften the beans after the woman had already sat down. The tin cup received each egg before cutting biscuits. The whey jug, tied with a dark string, stood behind the water jug, waiting for the next batch of dough. The shelf in Pocahontas County stood the jar of rendered fat tied with a red string. Packets of dried meat rested beside the gloves, the axe, and the cloth sack before heading into the woods. In Floyd County, a purple towel hung outside. The knife divided the pie into 6 portions, and the bundle of wild onions hanging on the porch announced that the ground had warmed once again. At the end of the journey stood the cracked plate beneath the sourdough crock, the bundle of mint lowered within reach, the ash bucket set outside the door, and half a cornbread loaf resting in a towel for the following morning. Save the liquid once meant saving what remained at the bottom of the pot. Now it means looking at something one more time before deciding its work is finished. Crumble bread into it once softened a piece of old bread. It also carried what remained into another meal, another person, another day. A kitchen does not need to serve a large family to still have a reason to keep the fire going. The card reading cornmeal, sour milk, grease. It's returned beside the one that read, "Save the liquid, crumble bread into it." One corner of the paper was smooth flat but still curled upward. The lid lowered, touched the wood warped by many years of stove heat, and stopped before closing completely. The corner of the card reading, "Save some bread for tomorrow morning," still protruded from the box. If your family once had a grease can, a sourdough crock, a skillet that always stayed near the stove, or someone who knew which portion needed to be saved, leave what you remember in the comments and follow Old American Kitchen. The recipe box still holds cards that have not yet been opened. Some recipes were never written down completely because the people who kept them believed there would still be time tomorrow to show someone how.